Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
My brother took my wife and built what he liked to call a perfect family, and I learned very quickly that there is a kind of quiet that feels like a bruise you do not touch, because you know it will flare if you do. So I did the only thing that made sense at the time, which was to go still, say as little as possible, keep my head down at work, and let everyone who needed a story make one up without me. Because if I tried to correct any of it, I would end up begging people who had already chosen their comfort over my life to see me clearly, and I refused to audition for basic respect. When it started, it did not look like a scandal. It looked like 1,000 small moments that I brushed off, because brushing off was easier than admitting I felt the floor tilt, like the way Lauren laughed at Ethan's jokes longer than mine. Or how they began sharing playlists and then errands and then excuses, and every time I felt a word crawl up my throat I swallowed it, because I did not want to be the jealous wife who makes a scene, and I did not want to hand my parents another reason to say, I am difficult, and I certainly did not want to make Thanksgiving even more uncomfortable than it already was. So I told myself that family is messy and adults can be friends, and I should not read into anything. Which turned out to be the dumbest thing I told myself in that whole stretch of my life. By the time the truth stood up and stopped pretending it was a misunderstanding, it was already arranged in a way that made me look like the leftover, because they had a plan, and they had the right smiles, and they had a chorus of people who were ready to be charmed. And I had anger I could not spend anywhere without paying for it twice, so I signed the papers the way you sign for a package you did not order, and I left the key on the counter like a stage direction, and I packed what fit in 2 trips, because dragging it out would have been one more performance for an audience that never clapped for me anyway. I told no one the ugliest parts, and that decision saved my dignity and cost me company, because when you do not explain yourself, people do not fill the silence with compassion. They fill it with what is easiest to repeat. And since Ethan is the oldest and Lauren is the pretty one and I am the one who does not cry in public, the narrative settled into something painless for everyone else, which was that love is complicated and sometimes people just find their true match. And the person left behind will be fine if she focuses on work and self-care and maybe a new hobby, a script that sounds supportive until you notice it is mostly a way to look away without feeling guilty. I built habits like rails. I woke early. I ran even when I hated it. I ate like fuel was not allowed to be a reward. I said yes to extra shifts, and I made my apartment so plain it felt like a clean page where nothing was going to leap out and surprise me. And for a while that steadiness kept me from looking back, because looking back was a luxury I could not afford if I wanted to keep my face from crumpling in the produce aisle or on the train or in a meeting where someone asked a normal question, and I could not remember the word for anything except gone. Then the accident happened, and I did not hear about it from family because family only calls when they want the easy version. I heard about it from a nurse who used to live in our building and who recognized Ethan's name when it came across the intake board. And she reached out with the careful voice people use when they do not know where the glass is on the floor, and she told me it was bad enough to change things and not bad enough to make them saints, which is exactly the kind of bad that turns every day into a bill. After that, the silence I had built like a shelter turned into a ringing phone, because as the deductibles piled up and the savings that looked impressive on social media turned out to be thinner in real life, they found their way to my number like water finds the lowest place, and the first message asked if we could talk, and the second said it was urgent, and the third said family sticks together. And after that the tone shifted into something that mixed pressure and apology like a cocktail. Someone thinks you will not taste if they stir it enough. I did not answer, not because I wanted them to hurt, but because I needed to hear my own thoughts without their script playing over mine. So I let the calls stack up while I sat at my tiny table and wrote down every cost they had floated at me through mutual friends and relatives who suddenly rediscovered my contact information. And I made a list of what I knew for a fact and what I would need to see in writing, and I traced a line through the middle of the page where I wrote what helping would actually mean for my future as opposed to what it would do for my reputation with people who had already shown me that my reputation with them was negotiable. I remembered the night I moved out when Mom walked me to the elevator and said that I was being very mature about the whole thing, and I remembered how the word mature tasted like cardboard. And I realized that if I picked up the phone too soon I would be right back in that hallway, making everyone else comfortable at the expense of my own oxygen, and I promised myself that whatever I did next would not be a performance. So I let it ring, and then, when I finally texted back, I did not apologize for the delay, and I did not soften my tone, and I did not pretend we were going to pretend. I wrote one sentence that took the air out of their momentum and put it back into my lungs, a single line that said, "I will meet exactly once in a public place, and if you want my help you will bring every bill, every explanation of benefits," and a notarized statement from each of you acknowledging how we got here and accepting my conditions without negotiation. And when you read this, understand that silence from me is not cruelty, it is policy, which is how I closed my door without slamming it, and how I set the table for something other than their version of mercy. When I finally sat down to meet Claire in that cafe she had chosen, the first thing I noticed was not her appearance or how tired she looked, but the way she kept her hands on the table, fingers twitching near her phone as if she was terrified I might stand up and leave before she could pour everything out. And it struck me how far we had traveled from the smug days when she used to post photos of barbecues and vacations with captions about how blessed her family was, because now her voice cracked before the coffee even cooled, and she went straight into the list of expenses, explaining how the insurance had denied certain parts of the treatment and how the rehabilitation was going to stretch for months that she could not imagine paying for. And with every word I could feel the air thickening with the truth she had tried to hide for years, which was that the image of stability and success had always been more fragile than she admitted, and I could see in her eyes that asking me was the last thing she wanted to do, but it was also the only thing left. She talked so fast it sounded like confession, telling me about the mortgage, the credit cards, the way she had dipped into the kids' college accounts because the bills came faster than she could process. And I sat there stirring a coffee I did not even want while she painted a picture of desperation that she had once believed belonged only to people she judged. And it was not lost on me that the very woman who had smirked when my marriage collapsed, the woman who used to toss little barbs about how some people just were not strong enough to hold on to a husband, was now leaning forward with tears she did not bother to wipe because she knew pity would not come from me, and maybe that was the point. Maybe she wanted me to see her stripped down so I would remember she was human, but the truth is I never forgot she was human. I just never forgot she was cruel too. The calls had already worn grooves in my patience, but listening to her in person was something else entirely, because I could hear the hollow in her tone that only appears when pride has finally collapsed under the weight of need. And I realized how much she hated herself for being there with me, how much she hated that I now had the choice she once took from me, the choice of whether to step in or walk away, and I let her keep talking not because I wanted details, but because I wanted to watch her unravel every stitch of the story she had woven for the world, and by the time she stopped for breath I could almost hear the silence asking me to either rescue or abandon her. I leaned back and asked questions I already knew would sting. What happened to all the vacations, the boat Ethan used to brag about, the house upgrades they bragged about to our parents, and when she whispered that it was gone, sold or leveraged or simply swallowed by debt, I knew I had struck the nerve I was looking for, because in that moment she realized I was not the girl she could roll over anymore. I was the one keeping score, and I wanted her to feel what it was like to be cornered by someone who held all the cards. The irony was not lost on me that in the years I rebuilt myself from the ashes they left me in, while I kept my head down and saved and worked without flaunting, they had been performing a play for the neighbors and the extended family, pretending the perfect family was a permanent achievement, and now with Ethan unable to work, the spotlight had gone cold and the audience had left, and all that was left was the truth. They had burned through the savings, and they were not nearly as secure as they wanted everyone to believe, and it was me, the one they discarded, who had enough put away to make a difference. I could have said no right there. I could have pushed the chair back and left her at that sticky little table to call the next relative on her list, but something in me resisted that clean exit because it felt too merciful. It felt too much like letting her close the book with a bitter ending where I was still painted as the cold one. So instead I nodded as if I were considering it. I asked her to bring me every document she mentioned, every bill, every piece of paper that showed what they owed and what they had already tried, and when she agreed so quickly it was almost a relief. I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her, desperate enough to hand me the evidence of her downfall, and naive enough to think my silence so far had been kindness instead of calculation. When I left the cafe that day, I did not promise money. I did not even promise hope. I promised to review the papers, and I let the vagueness hang there, because I knew she would fill it with what she wanted to believe, that I was softening, that I was remembering the old times, that maybe I still had some loyalty left to family, and while she held on to that illusion, I walked back to my apartment with something new lodged in my chest. Not anger anymore, not grief, but a sharp sense of timing. Because for the first time in years, I was the one they could not ignore, and the one they could not control, and it felt like the ground was finally tilting in my favor. That night, as the phone lit up again with her number, I did not pick up. I just watched it ring and thought about how quickly the mighty fall when the bills start stacking higher than the excuses, and I realized that I was not going to simply say no. I was going to make sure they understood every step of what it meant to come crawling back to the person they once left behind, and the plan started writing itself in my head before I even admitted I was going to do it. The next afternoon, a courier dropped a thick envelope on my doormat that looked like a desperate person had emptied a drawer into it and prayed the mess would become order by the time it reached me. And when I sat down at my kitchen table and started sorting through the bent statements and the pink past due slips and the insurance explanation pages that explain almost nothing, I could see in plain black and white what Claire's shaking voice had tried to sell as unfortunate but temporary. Because the truth mapped itself across those pages with the kind of clarity you only get when someone stops performing and starts bleeding facts, and what I saw was a year of overreach, a refinance that had seemed clever when interest was low, a stack of retail cards opened for points that turned into anchors, an out-of-network specialist chosen because the website looked impressive, and a private room upgrade that no one with a calculator would have approved if pride had been given a chair. Outside the door, I made columns the way I learned to make lines when everything fell apart the first time, one for what had to be paid now to keep the surgery on the calendar, one for what could be negotiated if a calm voice called the billing office and refused to be rushed, and one for what would never have been necessary if someone had told the truth sooner. And while I worked, I called the hospital financial counselor and asked what their charity policy required and what a conditional guarantor could actually do without being trapped, and I learned that there were pathways available that no one in that perfect family had bothered to walk, because those paths begin with humility, which was a currency they had never saved. By the time I finished the first pass, the plan inside my head felt less like revenge and more like governance, and I found that distinction useful because it kept my hands steady while I drafted an email to Claire that was firm without being cruel, laying out what would happen if she wanted my name anywhere near those bills, starting with the sale of non-essential assets, the cancellation of every vanity subscription that had survived while the minimums ate their checking account, the transfer of access so I could audit without excuses, and an agreement in writing that acknowledged the exact way we had arrived here, including dates that everyone pretended were fuzzy when they were not. Because if I was going to step in, I wanted a record that did not bend with the next family gust. When we met again, I brought a folder with tabs, and I watched her eyes track the labels like a student who has just realized there will be no extra credit, and I explained that I would make a hardship appointment with the hospital, that I would get the surgeon's office to recode what was misbilled and to authorize the in-network assist they should have used from the beginning, and that I would, if every condition was met, place a deposit to keep the date from slipping, but that the deposit would not be a gift, it would be a bridge with a toll, and the toll would be honesty written down in permanent ink and a power of attorney limited to finances related to the care plan, so that I could steer without having to beg. And when she said that sounded extreme, I told her extreme is when you leave someone to rebuild on her own while you pose in group photos, and this, what I was asking for, was accountability with a calendar. She tried to bargain the way people bargain when they still hope the old rules will apply, asking if we could keep it between us and maybe not involve extended family or my parents who had always preferred not to know. And I said that secrecy was the soil where this family grew its worst ideas, so part of the arrangement would be a letter sent to our parents and to the aunt who loves to hold court, A letter that declared the facts without commentary and made it clear that if they wanted to pressure anyone about tone, they could take it up with the clock running on the operating room, because I was done absorbing the discomfort so others could claim peace. She signed the drafts with a hand that trembled and then steadied when she reached the page where the affair timeline was listed in simple language, and she looked at me like she wanted to argue with the past, and then realized the past was not open for negotiation. And after she initialed the clause that put me in control of disbursements and stripped them of the private room luxury they could not afford, I slid one more sheet across the table, a statement addressed to the hospital that named me as conditional guarantor pending compliance with every item in the checklist, and I watched her read the words conditional and pending as if they were written in another language. And I let her sit there until they sank in, because comprehension was part of the price. That night I scheduled the hardship meeting and sent a measured email to the surgeon's billing coordinator with the codes and the policy excerpts highlighted, and then I drafted the family letter and left it in my drafts, because timing is not just part of power. It is the part that makes people remember who actually moved the pieces, and before I went to bed, I placed the deposit authorization form under a magnet on the fridge where I could see it every time I poured water, a simple reminder that the difference between charity and strategy is who sets the terms. And in the morning, when Claire texted a photo of the signed pages and asked if I would send the deposit before lunch because the scheduler was calling, I typed a response that was longer than she wanted and softer than she deserved, telling her that the hospital would get my voice before it got my money, and that once we were in the room and everyone had agreed to my map, the transfer would happen, which is exactly when I asked her to bring one more thing to the meeting, a house key and a car title, because if I was going to carry them across this canyon, I intended to choose the bridge, the toll, and the view from the other side. The day we walked into the hospital's financial services office, with Claire clutching a folder I had already organized and Ethan pale and stubborn in a wheelchair that squeaked at every turn, I understood that the real negotiation was not going to be about codes or copays or deductibles. It was going to be about whether I allowed the same people who broke me to set the tone for my help. And I decided before we sat down that I would not yield an inch to anyone's comfort, because comfort is the language they used when they told me to accept what they did and be mature about it. So when the counselor asked who would be the guarantor and Claire started to jump in with my name, I lifted a hand and spoke slowly, laying out the terms I had already emailed the night before, that I would be a conditional guarantor only after the hospital refiled the pre-authorization to a network, after the surgeon's office corrected the coding that had been padded like a bad invoice, and after charity screening and payment plan options had been exhausted in writing, with copies to me and attached to the account. And I watched the counselor's eyebrows rise in that careful way people do when they realize they are not dealing with another panicked relative, but with someone who has spent long nights turning fury into procedure. Ethan tried to interrupt with the old brother voice that used to shut me down at the dinner table, the one that says, "Let me handle this, because I know better." And I kept my eyes on the counselor as I said that any deposit from me would be placed only after a limited power of attorney went into effect that authorized me to manage the medical bills, the repayment plan, and the asset liquidation we had already agreed to, and that the titles placed in my custody were not ornamental gestures of good faith but real collateral that I would move on if they backtracked, which is when the counselor, professional to her bones, asked the question that mattered most, and that no one in my family had ever asked: whether the situation included a history that might complicate communication, and I said yes, it included betrayal, public humiliation disguised as family unity, and years of silence paid for in cash and pride, and that the only reason I was here was because I wanted the result to be ethical and efficient rather than chaotic and performative, which is something hospitals appreciate more than people realize, because efficiency saves lives and money in the same hour. The counselor nodded and began to outline the charity tiers, the automatic discounts that apply the minute you stop pretending a private room is a birthright, the recoding that could knock down the anesthesiology line that looked like a dare, And every time she spoke, I took notes with the same patience I used to use for picking glass out of my own shoes, while Claire watched me with the dawning awareness that I was not simply helping, I was building a record, and that record would not allow her to rewrite the parts that made her look like a victim of bad luck rather than a partner in a string of bad choices, which became unmistakable when I slid a second envelope across the table addressed to my parents and to the aunt who loves a phone tree. A short letter that summarized the arrangement, the charity policy, the asset list, and the condition that all future family commentary about my role would be grounded in these facts rather than in whatever story made holidays easier for them to swallow, and Claire signed the copies with a grim little nod because she knew the alternative was me walking out without looking back. I asked for the counselor's name, direct line, and the charity application checklist. Then I called the surgeon's billing coordinator from the chair in that office with the speaker on so everyone could hear me recite the codes she needed to correct. And when she tried the usual shrug about how the system sometimes defaults in ways no one can control, I read the policy paragraph that spells out how to override the default, and by the time I hung up, the first 2 bricks of their mountain had been chipped away by something they never expected to face again, which is me with facts and stamina instead of tears and apologies. And in that moment, I felt the room tilt back to level for the first time in years, not because of money, not because of pity, but because I had made the ground obey a standard they could not wiggle around. After the hospital meeting, I took them to a notary on the first floor and executed the limited power of attorney and the lien agreements on the car and the boat Ethan used to brag about in group texts. And when he protested that the boat was already listed for sale and that this was overkill for a sister, I replied that I was no longer playing the sister role he liked. I was acting as the only adult in a situation he had decorated until it rotted, and I would not risk a single dollar without the authority to prevent further damage, and I said it in the straight tone people use when they are done seeking permission to protect themselves, which shut him up faster than any argument we ever had. That evening, before I sent the deposit, I scheduled a brief video call with my parents and the aunt and 2 cousins who had repeated the worst gossip with the widest smiles. And with Claire and Ethan on mute beside me, I read the same letter I had filed at the hospital. Then I added a line that did not exist on paper, a requirement that Claire and Ethan would record a short statement to the family archive acknowledging the affair timeline and my role in stabilizing the finances, and that the statement would be emailed from their shared account to every relative who had received an invitation to their anniversaries, because I was done sponsoring fairy tales that cost me sleep, and when my mother tried the trembly appeal to keep it private for the sake of peace, I said that peace purchased with my silence had already been returned for cause, and that the only currency I accepted now was accuracy, and I watched the cousins nod slowly as if a spell had broken at last. When the calls ended and the emails went out and the notary stamps dried on the pages that had once been unthinkable, I opened my banking app to schedule the hospital deposit and saw the text from the counselor confirming that charity had approved the highest tier and that the corrected coding had cut the remaining balance in half, which meant that the amount I was about to send would function more like a lever than like a lifeline. And as I hovered over the confirmation button, I realized that I had one last condition to set before money moved, a condition no one in that small circle would see coming, and that would change more than the bill due date. So I closed the app without sending and drafted a single sentence to Claire that would force a choice she had avoided for years, and that would make tomorrow a very different kind of meeting. When I told Claire in that final message that before I released a single dollar, she and Ethan would need to sit in front of a camera, record themselves explaining in their own words exactly how they had built their perfect family on the ruins of mine, and send it to the same relatives who had once pretended not to notice the betrayal, I knew it was a condition she would choke on, but I also knew she would have no choice, because by then the hospital deposit I controlled was not just money, it was the thin thread holding together their timeline for surgery, rehabilitation, and the version of their dignity they were still trying to salvage. And watching her face when she realized I was serious reminded me of the first time she smirked in my direction after moving in with my husband. Except this time the smirk was gone and all that was left was the naked recognition that the story had changed and I was the one holding the script. Ethan tried to push back, of course, his voice strained with the same mixture of pride and desperation that used to silence me in family arguments, saying that what I was asking was cruel and unnecessary, and that he would rather delay the surgery than sign his name to something so humiliating. But I leaned across the table, lowered my voice so he had to listen to every word, and reminded him that humiliation was what he and Claire had chosen for me when they decided that their happiness mattered more than my life, when they paraded their new beginning in front of relatives who already enjoyed whispering about my supposed failures, and when they acted as if the wound they caused would fade faster if they smiled wider. And I told him that if he wanted to call it cruelty, he was welcome to, but that from where I sat it looked a lot like symmetry, and that symmetry is the closest thing to justice our family would ever see. Claire broke first, just as I knew she would, because pride had never been her strongest shield. Money was, and when the money was gone she would bend to whatever terms kept the lights on. So she asked what exactly the statement had to include. And I handed her a page I had typed out the night before, outlining in precise sentences the acknowledgement of the affair, the timeline, the betrayal, and the debt, not dressed up with apologies or explanations, just facts written plainly, because I had learned over the years that facts are sharper than any insult, and that once spoken they hang in the air long enough to suffocate every attempt to twist them into something softer. We recorded it in my apartment, not in their house, because I wanted them on my ground for once, and I set up my phone on the table while they sat side by side, shoulders tight, eyes flicking between the page and the lens. And as they read I could see the flush creep up their necks, the way shame and resentment fought for space on their faces, and when they finished I pressed stop, saved the file, and sent it to the family group chat without ceremony. No introduction, no commentary. Just the truth in their own voices delivered directly to the audience that had once applauded their performance, and the silence that followed in that chat was the kind of silence that tells you a myth has collapsed and no one is ready to admit they believed it. Only then did I open my banking app and authorize the deposit, because keeping my word mattered more to me than making them squirm a minute longer. And once the confirmation came through I closed the phone and looked at them sitting on my couch like guests who had overstayed a party no one enjoyed. And I said very simply that from this point forward I would manage the bills until the repayment plan was set, and that after the last dollar cleared they would not hear from me again, because revenge, if it is done correctly, is not a lifelong occupation. It is a single act executed with precision that leaves no doubt about where the balance now rests. In the days that followed, the surgery happened on schedule. The hospital applied every discount and charity tier I had forced them to acknowledge, and the final number on the ledger was less than half of what they had originally feared. But it still sat heavy on their shoulders, and every monthly reminder from the billing office went through my hands first, each payment deducted from the accounts I controlled, each receipt filed in the folders I had labeled, and while they lived with the weight of explaining to neighbors why the boat was gone and why the private room had turned into a shared ward, I lived with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the story had been rewritten, not by rumors or by half-truths, but by the exact people who had once tried to erase me. When the last statement cleared and I sent the closing letter to the hospital releasing my authority over their account, I did not call Claire, I did not text Ethan, and I did not join the inevitable family discussion that tried to soften what had happened into some narrative of reconciliation, because the truth is I was not interested in reconciliation, I was interested in closure. And closure came the moment I realized that they could never again play the roles of the golden couple without everyone in the family hearing their recorded voices reminding them exactly what they had done and exactly who had kept them from collapsing completely. So now, when the phone rings and their number flashes across my screen, I let it ring, not because I am angry still, and not because I am savoring the silence, but because I no longer owe them an answer, and the one thing betrayal never taught me, but revenge finally did, is that sometimes the cleanest victory is not walking away in rage, but sitting still in peace while the people who thought they buried you live every day under the shadow of what you made them say out loud.